Jonathan Djanogly.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I speak to new clause 23 in my name and that of the Right Honourable Member for Barking, and I think some 17 other honourable members from across this House whose support I was grateful for. This comprehensive bill is significant in terms of both scope and intention to counter fraud, and of course this is wholly welcome. New clause 23, however, speaks to the lack of focus placed on the proceeds of economic crime contained within the bill, and that is proceeds resulting from acts committed both here in the UK and overseas. Such proceeds have circulated in the national economy largely unimpeded for too long, with a host of existing limitations and issues having a compounding negative effect, such as the lack of proper financing for related law enforcement bodies, and this has been discussed much over the last 2 days. Unfortunately, these limitations are all too frequently at the expense of and detriment to hard-working and honest taxpayers up and down the country, not least in all of our constituencies and mine in Huntingdon, and those that often stand to benefit are the criminals, as well as those sanctioned for reasons relating to foreign affairs, and tackling this issue is the primary motivation behind this amendment. More broadly, it is also an area that is increasingly being focused on in like-minded countries, including by our fellow parliamentarians in Canada, who in June last year made technical yet significant changes to their economic sanctions legislation, including the Sergei Magnitsky law regime, effectively allowing for existing sanctions for freezing assets to be converted into orders for the seizure of those assets. Similar measures are now being considered by the EU Commission, in other European countries such as Tallinn and in the United States. And unless our regulatory measures vis-à-vis the proceeds of economic crime are reviewed and strengthened, the UK risks falling behind. This, I believe, would be both morally and politically unpalatable. I also believe that new clause 23 speaks to the wider lack of a much-needed national conversation about such proceeds, where they are held, why they are in the UK, and crucially, what the potential benefits on clamping down on them could be. It would, I suggest, be to the clear benefit of the taxpayer, but also, crucially, those elsewhere in need of financial reparations, such as in Ukraine, if the proceeds could be seized, repurposed and put to work. And I say this recognising that in September it was estimated by the World Bank that at least $349 billion would be needed for Ukraine's reconstruction. One can only imagine that the figure is now much more significant. It is, however, important to recognise that it is not enough for measures to be simply passed into law, but their implementation must be backed, supported and seen through, with the American authorities providing a notable example of one such action which I thought would be of interest to the House. In May of last year, a $300 million yacht, property of a sanctioned Russian oligarch, was seized by Fiji at the United States' request in a joint law enforcement operation. This followed the issuance of a seizure warrant which declared the yacht in question to be subject to forfeiture based on probable cause of violations of US law, including money laundering and conspiracy. In other words, it was not the asset freezing sanctions themselves that enabled seizure, but rather the active enforcement of the breach of such sanctions. Such violations and action, however, should not be looked at in isolation, but instead should also be considered in the wider context of international affairs, namely Russia's brutal, illegal and ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Coordinated through the US Justice Department's Klepto Capture Task Force, the yacht in question, seizure, sent a blunt message that, and I put this in the words of the FBI Director Christopher Wray, those who contribute to the advancement of Russia's malign activities will be sought and brought to justice, regardless of where or how they attempt to hide. This is a message, a strong message, that can't be ignored or overlooked. This yacht seizure was a clear example of the rigorous enforcement of the law, and one which I believe should be emulated here in the UK, with related regulatory measures subsequently strengthened on top. The recent arrest of another oligarch in London on suspicion of money laundering in breach of asset freezing sanctions was a step in the right direction. The problem in the UK is, however, that the criminality of breaking sanctions attaches to the quantum of the breach and not the overall value of the amount sanctioned. So, for example, if a sanctioned oligarch were to be found with a carrier bag full of sanctions breaching cash, that cash amount is all that is liable for confiscation and not his wider sanctioned wealth. This was why we attempted to table a cross-party amendment, the so-called chink in the armour amendment, as described by the Right Honourable Lady earlier. This proposed, in short, that non-disclosure of all assets by a sanctioned individual would itself be a criminal offence, and that the total frozen amount could be subject to seizure as a penalty for such offence. Of course, this is a much lighter step than providing, as in Canada, for the Attorney General to be given the power to convert freezing orders into seizing orders. And I also tried to table such an amendment, by the way. Unfortunately, these proposals were deemed to be out of scope of the bill, which is why we are only debating the broader terms of this new Clause 23. However, given that this bill follows on from the Economic Crime Transparency and Enforcement Act of last year, which involved fast-tracking sanctions laws in response to the invasion of Ukraine, it does seem slightly ironic to me that updating that sanctions regime falls outside the scope of this follow-on bill. Nonetheless, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do of course accept the House ruling on that issue, but I implore the Minister and the Foreign Office who lead on this issue to stop passing the buck between departments, as we keep seeing, and to listen to the majority of honourable members across all parties who feel that Russia and Russians as the aggressors must pay for their barbarity and devastation of Ukraine, and not just leave it up to the British and Western taxpayers to foot the bill for Ukraine's reconstruction. I would also, Madam Deputy Speaker, like to speak to new Clause 4, creating an offence of failure to prevent fraud in the name of my right honourable friend for South Swindon, which was so powerfully and expertly proposed by the right honourable gentleman earlier. And this is a very important proposal that attempts to close a large gap in our existing fraud legislation book. And I go back to 2010 here, when, as Shadow Solicitor General, I led for the then Conservative opposition on the Bribery Act, and then we saw that in once we came into government. And it was into that act that was added, working on a pretty cross-party basis, the concept of the senior managers of a venture being liable for bribery happening at the coalface if they couldn't show that they took all reasonable steps to prevent that bribery from happening. Before that, prosecutors had to prove at each layer of management that those above them, the so-called directing minds, were guilty of the crime, which was almost always impossible in practice with larger companies. And my right honourable friend explained this at some length earlier on, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But as my right honourable friend described, this legislation focuses the minds of management, especially in big companies, that they think carefully about the processes that they have in place, and that they then regularly review such processes. And this approach says also that inaction is not acceptable, let alone an excuse. So the resulting new bribery law was considered a great success. I recall having a discussion around a decade ago with the then SFO director, Sir David Green, who then was publicly advocating the same change to be made to the offence of fraud. And I note that the current director is saying exactly the same. So just putting that in context, the main fraud prosecutors in this country have consistently been saying for over a decade that they need this legislation to do their jobs properly. But here we are, some dozen years later, and it still hasn't happened. I'm frankly amazed by this, and I'm still not quite sure why it hasn't happened. I heard the history of how it was delayed from my right honourable friend, but I'm still not sure why it was delayed. I recall now the now Lord Chancellor talking of consulting on this back in 2016, so again, why the inaction? And together with other Right Honourable and Honourable Members, I got a letter dated 20th of January from the Home Office and Bayes Ministers saying that, and I quote, they are carefully assessing options. Does this imply another dozen years of assessing something that we all know needs to happen? If we are going to be serious on combating fraud, we need to be getting on with this. If the government is not happy with the wording in new clause 4, then I think they really should be coming up with their own wording, because fraud now constitutes just under half of all crime committed in the UK, and we need to be doing more to counter it at all levels.
Order. Order.